So we saw in the first study how David and Sheba invested pretty heavily in the early days for Solomon with that divine education we talked about, and of course made the point that was reflected to a large extent in the book of Proverbs. And we saw how it paid dividends because, of course, Adonijah reared his ugly head not once but twice, and Solomon came through that really quite brilliantly. So in this session, what I would like to do is to continue along by looking at how Solomon kept on, and he did, growing and developing in his early years as king. Sometimes in life we see things, particular achievements, perhaps maybe a project, where the results, they're just breathtaking. You almost look at it and think, well, how did they do that? That was pretty much impossible. Even in the secular world, you can see this. So you see, buildings like the Burj Khalifa in Dubai, really tall building, absolutely incredible. Not clear how they pulled that off. The Great Wall of China, so obviously it happened a lot earlier than that. The moon landing, these things are just unbelievable, really, how they've been pulled off. And then on a smaller scale, we sometimes see these things in a different way, but we see them in an ecclesial context, in the truth. So sometimes you hear about some phenomenal thing going on in the mission field, and it's just, wow, you'd think that's just fantastic. Or there might be a youth group that's just on fire and doing all sorts of great things. Or another topical one, a youth conference. You go to something like a youth conference, and it's just absolutely life-changing because it's just so special. No pressure, Fraser, but yeah, that's the benchmark. And it can just be so impressive, and obviously it has more lasting impact than the Burj Khalifa or something like that. And it can leave us, as we reflect on these things, we can kind of look at it and go, well, how on earth did they do it? How do people do these things? Maybe we even might think, well, why can't I do that kind of thing? What's wrong with me? Well, in this session, we're going to see how that, aside from, yes, Solomon had great preparations and a lot of investment was made into him for sure, but on top of that, he did have a couple of tricks up his sleeve that were just incredible as to how he operated, how he got things done, how he approached the temple project. He had these things he did, and one of them was not so much a method but more of a motive. He had excellent motives early in this stage of his life. Excellent motives. And we're going to see that pretty well straight away in the first story we look at. But he also had this knack for working with other people. He was very, very good at working with other people, at getting the right people in the right place at the right time, getting them motivated and working and marching in the same direction. He was a very, very good leader of men and of women. He was excellent. And I hope we're going to see that come out in this session. Okay, so we left off at the end of 1 Kings 2, and we saw that Adonijah was dealt with second time around. So that's all behind us. Now, following that, we just read it, the start of 1 Kings 3, there's a record of his marriage to his Egyptian bride. Now, we're not going to deal with that right now. I'm going to deal with all the ladies in Solomon's life in the exhortation, actually. So sort of park that just at this stage, but we will come back to that. Then after that is the record of the sacrifice at Gibeon, which we've got another little picture there. So you see it represented on the screen. So he went to Gibeon. You've got the ark there in the background. Not the ark, sorry, the tabernacle. And he was going to seek his God, because David, at that second coronation, there is a record where David actually says specifically to his son Solomon, he says, if thou seek him, he will be found of thee. 1 Chronicles 28 and verse 9. And now the time had come to follow through with that on a pretty grand scale, actually. Solomon was going to seek his God, but not just on his own. He, as the great leader he was, he got everybody involved. 2 Chronicles 1 verse 2, I'll just read it to you. The captains of thousands and hundreds and judges and every governor in Israel. He got them all to come along because he wanted them to get involved in this exercise. So off he goes to Gibeon to make a sacrifice. And we read about that in 1 Kings 3 and at verse 3, which says, Solomon loved Yahweh, walking in the statutes of David his father, Only he sacrificed and burnt incense in the high places. And the king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was the great high place. 1,000 burnt offerings did Solomon offer upon the altar. So he sacrificed 1,000 burnt offerings. So this was a big deal. Just imagine that number of sacrifices. Even 10 or 20 is seems like an awful lot. 1,000. So this was pretty exciting. It was a really big deal, and he got everyone involved in the event. I think he pretty early in his reign, he wanted to make a statement. He wanted to draw an association between himself and God, what he valued, and he wanted everyone to get around that. But there is that interesting phrase, isn't there, in verse 3? Only. I think it's a key word. Only. Because what it's telling us is there's something not quite right here. Solomon was actually kind of misguided on this occasion, because although it was the great high place, it was the best high place, if you like, it was still a high place. He was sacrificing at a high place, and you were not meant to sacrifice or worship anywhere other than God's designated place. And we know that because it says it in Deuteronomy 12 verse 5. You shall seek the place that Yahweh your God will choose out of all your tribes to put his name and make his habitation there. There you will go. Deuteronomy 12 verse 5. And that was, of course, a lesson that Jeroboam, who came a little later on, he learnt that the hard way, didn't he? As he built those 2 golden calves to sort of counteract the political advantage that Rehoboam, post the splitting of the kingdom, that he had, because the place of worship that was designated was, of course, Jerusalem. And so it was a political tactic on his part. But it was wrong. It was obviously wrong. And he paid so dearly for that, and so did his people. And for Solomon, there was a better option. It wasn't like, it almost reads like he didn't have a choice. He did have a choice. He could have gone to Jerusalem. It comes out later in the record. He could, in the same chapter, he could have gone to Jerusalem. It was an option. It just didn't seem to be in vogue for whatever reason. And if you look, I'll put a quote up on the screen. I don't know hope you can read that. So this is from the Chronicles record, 2 Chronicles 1 verse 2 to 5. Now I've taken it from a pretty admittedly dynamic translation, but I do think it captures the sense pretty well, and it gives a very clear understanding of what is happening here. Let's just read that. At that time, that's a contemporary English version, by the way. At that time, the sacred tent, so that's the tabernacle that Moses, the servant of Yahweh, had made in the desert, was still kept at Gibeon. And in front of the tent was the bronze altar that Bezaleel had made. One day, Solomon told the people of Israel, the army of commanders, the officials, the family leaders, so all the leadership went to go with him to the place of worship at Gibeon. Even though his father, King David, had already moved the sacred chest, which is the ark, from Kiriath-Jearim to the tent that he had set up for it in Jerusalem. So there was a tent in Jerusalem, and that was where you were meant to go. So there was a right place to worship, and that's where the ark was, and that was Jerusalem. Even before the temple was built, that option existed. And Solomon, he really should have known that. But despite all that, for some reason, Solomon and everyone else, they went to Gibeon to worship Yahweh, and it was wrong. But what is clearly not wrong, when we read the record, is his motive. So he's different to Jeroboam in that sense. Jeroboam's motivation was pure politics. And we know that's the case because if we read, say, verse 5, look at what happens in this verse where it says, in Gibeon, Yahweh, so look at how God reacts. Yahweh appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, ask what I shall give thee. So this gives us a feel for how God interpreted this action. This is God's reaction. It was clearly a response of approval, right? He offers Solomon this wish. It's almost like those kid stories about a genie in a lantern. He said, "What would you like? You can have whatever you like." That is a response of approval. And in responding to that amazing offer, the purity of Solomon's motives is highlighted even further. Because look at what he goes on to ask for. He's essentially been offered anything. 1 Kings 3 verse 6, and Solomon said, Thou hast showed unto thy servant David my father great mercy, according as he walked before thee in truth, and in righteousness, and in the uprightness of heart with thee. And thou hast kept for him this great kindness, that thou hast given him a son to sit on his throne, as it is this day. And now, O Yahweh my God, thou hast made thy servant king instead of David my father, and I am but a little child. Look at the humility here. I know not how to go out or how to come in. And thy servant is in the midst of a people which thou hast chosen, a great people that cannot be numbered for or counted for multitude. Give therefore thy servant an understanding heart to judge thy people, that I may discern between good and bad. For who is able to judge this so great a people? So it's an amazing, amazing reply. Solomon is offered this blank canvas wish. And he says, well, all I really want is I just want to gain wisdom, because I'm not that wise, and I've got all these people to look after, and I want to help them. So can you help me with some wisdom, God? What would we ask for? What would you ask for if God said you could have anything? It'd be kind of tempting, wouldn't it, to ask for something that was less altruistic, that was less about helping other people. And he wasn't asking for it to be the smartest guy in the room. He was asking for it to help people. He wanted to be wise to help people. And not surprisingly, look at God's reaction. He approved. He was happy with that request. And because of the selfless nature of that request, he went on to promise other things. He said, look, because you did that, you can have riches, honour, long life, with a caveat, if you do the right thing. And of course, we know where the story heads, and that if, unfortunately, comes into play. But nevertheless, it was a very positive response from God. It's kind of ironic, though, isn't it, that these riches amongst the others he gained in a way ultimately became a snare for him. But that's a story we'll come back to later on. Anyhow, it was an incredible set of blessings that he received. And it's interesting, as we keep reading this record, to note that Solomon actually, after all this is done, he heads off, not to Gibeon, but he goes to the right place to worship. He goes to Jerusalem. 1 Kings 3 verse 15. It says, Solomon awoke, so after all this is done, behold, it was a dream, and he came to Jerusalem and stood before the ark of the covenant of Yahweh, and offered up burnt offerings and offered peace offerings, and made a feast to all his servants. Now, why do you think he went to Jerusalem this time and not back to repeat the Gibeon exercise? Look at the response he got. It was well received. Perhaps, I don't know, but perhaps amidst the positive feedback, the blessings, I wonder if there wasn't a little correction given to Solomon about what he was doing here. We don't know for sure. But whatever the case, he did change. And I think there is an incredibly important lesson in this record, and it's this. If we are ever in any doubt as to whether it is, on one hand, the mechanics of how we do things, or the motives behind what we are doing that kind of wins, it's the latter. Hands down. Motives, this is one of the most clear places in Scripture to show this. Right? Motives win hands down. Hands down. Our motives and other people's motives, and we can't always tell what they are. We like to think we can, but we can't. They are supreme. Brothers and sisters, young people. So we should always, in terms of looking at ourselves, we should always just be careful and check and try and reflect on why am I doing this? Why am I pushing this? Why am I upset by this? What is the motive? Because our motives aren't always so good. But also on the flip side, we need to be really careful when we do look at someone and see, and we might be right, we might be dead right. We see someone like Solomon here doing something, and the mechanics, they're just not quite right. We know it's not right. We need to be careful not to judge too harshly and impute motives as we like to do, because maybe we're wrong and maybe the motives are excellent. But yeah, the mechanics are not always necessarily sound. Doesn't mean we don't try and correct that. Solomon, I think he was corrected here. But just be careful. We have to be careful around this motives versus mechanics piece. Okay, so after Gibeon, Solomon, he starts finding opportunities to use this wisdom that he's got. He already had wisdom. You can actually show that in the record, but now he's got even more. And he uses it the way that was intended. He's going to help other people. And probably one of the most famous examples of this is that incident where the two women are fighting about a baby. And, we see it there. Again, there's lots of artistic representations of this. It really is a very famous incident in Scripture. So there's Solomon, there's the baby, and of course the mother begging for the baby's life, which is what ended up happening. So just imagine this. So Solomon's there he is. He's in his throne room, fairly new king, still forming his reputation actually. And two women walk in, and they are torn between rage and utter despair. One has lost a baby, of course. 1 Kings 3 verse 16. Then came two women that were harlots unto the king and stood before him. And I won't read every verse because I think we know the story generally. One woman had an accident. She rolled onto her child in her sleep. The baby died. And in response to that, in her desperation, she switched her baby with the other lady's baby. Now, that was obviously not an awful thing to do, but that's what she did in that desperate circumstance. But then, of course, the other woman looks at the baby and she realises what she has done. She figures it out. And you might imagine that they would have argued and they couldn't resolve it. And so they figured they would go to this new king and let him settle it. So again, we're going to see Solomon's decision-making put to the test. And we read about this in verse 23 of 1 Kings 3, where it says, then said the king, the one saith, so he sort of just summarises what was happening. He said, the one says, this is my son that lives, and thy son is dead. And the other says, no, thy son is dead, and my son is the living. And the king said, so he's sort of saying, it's a bit hopeless, isn't it, ladies? Like, what am I supposed to do? You say black, you say white, I wasn't there. What am I supposed to do? There was no witnesses. And the king said, bring me a sword. And they brought a sword before the king. And the king said, divide the living child in two and give half to one and half to the other. So it's a pretty simple process he follows here. You probably couldn't, well, not probably, you couldn't do this in the legal system today. But we know it was extremely effective. He just listens, sits back, he listens like his father did. He repeats the facts and then he calls for a sword. And that flushes out the true mother. And it flushes out the false mother as well. It flushes them both out. Because it just exposes their feelings. They cannot hold back. One was full of hatred and one was full of love for that child in the end. And he flushed that out. See that in verse 26. Then spake the woman whose the living child was unto the king, for her bowels yearned upon her son, and she said, O my lord, give her the living child, and in no wise slay it. But the other said, let it neither be mine nor thine, but divide it. Then the king answered and said, give her the living child, and in no wise slay it. She is the mother thereof. So again, we can see how decisive Solomon could be. He was very quick on his feet. He was a very quick thinker. But you know what I actually find fascinating about this record is when I think about this kind of how this would have played out and whether I would have done the same thing. I don't know that I would have, because when I look at what he did, I think it was, on the surface, it was very risky. It looked risky to me. And I say that because he was essentially bluffing. He would never have cut that baby in half. This was a bluff. And if he had had that bluff called, his reputation was destroyed. This would have been a disaster if he'd been called out. And now, if anyone has ever, I don't know if anyone has done negotiation skills training, but if you ever do that, I'll teach you 2 golden rules. One of those rules is never exchange anything, or never give anything away for free. You always got to get something back, right? It's not a very Christ-like thing, negotiation training, but you always got to get something. The other golden, which is not relevant to this talk, but the other golden rule is relevant, and it's this, and they say, never, ever, ever bluff, never bluff. Because if you get called, you're finished. Your reputation as a negotiator is destroyed. You're out. And so Solomon actually broke kind of a golden rule. It makes sense, right? It's a common sense rule. Why would he do that? And I can only think because of what we talked about last time, John 2:25, shadowing our Lord Jesus Christ. He knew what was in man. He could tell. He could tell that bad woman, the one who didn't care about the child really, she was underestimating this new green king. She thought that he'd fall for this. She really did. She didn't know what she was dealing with, just like the rebels previously. He could see in her face she was motivated by hatred. He could read her like an open book. She wasn't in love with that child. And so he knew she would take the bait. And she did. She didn't call his bluff. It worked absolutely perfectly because he was absolutely certain she would fall for it. He had read them so perfectly. He was so good at doing that. I don't think it would have worked with everybody, but it worked with her, and he knew it would work with her. He was just a brilliant decision maker. Even under pressure like this, he could just think on his feet and make these fantastic decisions. So anyhow, that gave another boost to Solomon's fledgling reputation. Look at 1 Kings 3 verse 28. And all Israel heard of the judgment which the king had judged, and they feared the king, for they saw that the wisdom of God was with him to do judgment, which to me infers that up until this kind of defining moment, the young king still had some doubters. Some people weren't quite sure about him, but this was a turning point. This was a turning point. People were just floored by how he pulled this off. Now people feared him like a king ought to be feared. The extent of Solomon's wisdom was absolutely phenomenal. You look at this reference in chapter 4, verse 29. It says, God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding exceeding much, and largeness of heart, even as the sand that is on the seashore. Verse 30, and Solomon's wisdom excelled the wisdom of all the children of the east country and all the wisdom of Egypt. That phrase in verse 29, largeness of heart, it means what you kind of would think it means. It means he was generous. He was a very generous man. The Jubilee Bible calls it magnanimity of heart. He was a magnanimous man. So his wisdom, as we talked about before, it was wisdom designed to help people. It was practical wisdom, just like he had asked for at Gibeon. And aside from that brilliant decision-making, his wisdom was manifested in the form of lots of spoken and written achievements. 1 Kings 4 verse 31 talks about this. For he was wiser than all the men, than Ethan the Ezrahite, and Heman, and Chalcol, and Dada, the sons of Mahol. And his fame was in all the nations round about. And he spake 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. Verse 33 goes on to talk about how he loved zoology and botany. He drew, I think we know this, he drew lessons from nature. He was really good at doing that. And fortunately for us, about 800 of those 3,000 proverbs found their way into the book that has the same name, the book of Proverbs. And not only did he sort of put them in there and capture them for other people to benefit from, he was really clever about how he arranged them into themes or clusters, or I've heard someone liken it to garden beds. He designed the book of Proverbs meticulously. It can be kind of challenging but fun to try and figure out sometimes the groupings, but you generally can. And he did that to give them the most impact by putting them in those themes. Ecclesiastes 12:9 talks about this. Besides being wise, the preacher also taught the people knowledge, weighing and studying and arranging many proverbs with great care. And that is how the book of Proverbs is structured. So for Solomon, it was all about building, learning, sharing divine principles for daily life. And he did share them. And that's why we've got the book of Proverbs. That's why we've got the book of Ecclesiastes, right? There's so much. They're just brilliant books. There is so much in those. It's just like raw wisdom in those books. Bite-sized wisdom sometimes, just short, wonderful sayings that you just look at and think, wow, I wish I'd read that yesterday. It's just so good, those books. You know that he Solomon even inspired, in a way, our Lord Jesus Christ. The Greek word that is rendered parable in the New Testament is the same one that is rendered proverb in the Septuagint. Jesus' teaching style, which was built around practical lessons, talking about real-life objects, real-life situations, telling stories, that was derived from Solomon, I would suggest to you, who was just a great teacher of practical wisdom. I'll give you a few examples. I'll throw this out to you, actually. Try and see where the echo is. So I'm going to read you a proverb and you tell me where it comes up in the Gospels. You don't have to quote it exactly, but just, roughly. Proverbs 12:7, the wicked are overthrown and are not, but the house of the righteous shall stand. Any parables or anything come to mind? Maybe everyone's too shy. Yes, Brother Steve Hyman. Give the man a lolly. Right. Matthew 7:24, I will liken him to a wise man who builds his house upon a rock. Wisdom is justified of her children, Luke 7:35. Other way around this time. Proverb, or the general idea in Proverbs. I'll just tell you. Does not wisdom cry and understanding put forth her voice? So Solomon started this whole thing of personifying wisdom, and our Lord used that in his teachings. Last one, this one's a bit easier, so maybe someone a bit younger, under 18 or something, or maybe under 16. Proverbs 21 verse 20. So where is this in the Gospels? There is treasure to be desired and oil in the dwelling of the wise, but a foolish man spends it up. Any parables come to mind, kids? Here we go, Ryan. What's that? Prodigal son? Sort of. 10 virgins, yep. Jake. Well done, Jake. Perfect. Parable of the 10 virgins. Matthew 25, verse 8. And the foolish said unto the wise, give us of your oil, and the lamp's gone out. And you can go on and on and on. There are many, many, many examples of that where James is the same. Our Lord Jesus Christ and his half-brother, they draw heavily on the book of Proverbs and the general style of Solomon as a teacher. It was a very effective, simple, practical style that he had, and he was very, very good at it. But interesting as it is, and it's kind of interesting to do that and to map those things across and to see where Jesus draws upon Solomon, I don't think it's the key point necessarily. What I think is really important from this is it's just the simple lesson as to how Solomon approached wisdom. Our pursuits of Bible knowledge, we need to be careful as we pursue Bible knowledge, shouldn't become too academic or intellectual, okay? As if they are some kind of end in themselves. Our pursuit of scriptural knowledge needs to be designed to generate wisdom. And wisdom is a very practical thing. Wisdom is something that is used in the service of other people, like that poor mother who just about lost her baby. It is something that is to be shared around, like Solomon did when he went to all that effort to write down and group very carefully books like Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. And understood that way, our pursuits of Bible knowledge become a really powerful thing, a really practical thing for us and for the people around us. I think that's the lesson of how Solomon operated with this theme of wisdom. But the curious thing about wisdom and wise people is that the wiser we become, hopefully, if we do become wiser, the more we will tend to become aware that we aren't really very wise. It's one of those counterintuitive things in Scripture. You sort of, as you get more wise, you just realize, oh, I'm dumb, I'm not wise, why did I do that? And the more we start to see that in ourselves, the more we realise that we actually can't achieve all that much on our own. We need other people. It's one of the reasons we're in ecclesias. And Solomon, like his father before him, had the humility and the presence of mind and the wisdom to realise he wasn't all that wise, or he wasn't as wise as he would like to be. That's why he asked for wisdom at Gibeon. And so he built a structure, like his father before him. He built this leadership team under him to help manage the affairs of the kingdom. And we read about that in 1 Kings 4 from verse 1. We'll just read it. It's kind of hard to piece it all together, but we'll just read it and then I'll sort of I'll put it up as a sort of organisation chart on the screen, and you can get a feel for how it came together. So 1 Kings 4 verse 1, so King Solomon was king over all Israel. And these were the princes which he had: Azariah the son of Zadok the priest, Elihoreph and Ahiah the sons of Shisha scribes, Jehoshaphat the son of Ahilud the recorder, and Benaiah the son of Jehoiada was over the host. And Zadok and Abiathar were the priests. And Azariah the son of Nathan was over the officers, and Zabud the son of Nathan was principal officer and the king's friend. And Ahisha was over the household, and Adoniram the son of Abdar was over the tribute. Okay. Now, I will put it up in a second. It's sort of a bit clearer when you actually draw it out. But just before we do that, a general comment around organisation design. Like it's quite a difficult thing. Like some of us, if you work in a big company, you probably see people never stop reorging big companies. They just don't seem to be able to stop. And I've seen lots of reorganisations. And my observation is that when people do that, one of the things they're grappling with is trade-offs. They're trying to trade off different factors to get a design that sort of does what they want it to do and does less of what they don't need to do less of, that sort of thing, right? So it is about trade-offs. People have to decide what is really important that they want reflected in that organisation. And I think that's some of the things that Solomon had to deal with. He had to think about, well, my father's got an organisation, but now I want to look at that and possibly change that because I've got different things to achieve. So he had to weigh all that up. And I think as Solomon did that, he was when you look at what resulted, I think there was kind of two broad things he was looking to balance. On one hand, I think he understood his father's team was really, really effective, and he wanted to build on and certainly not lose the strengths that his father had established in his team. They were tried, they were proven, there was loyalists there. Why wreck it? But he did want to make some changes that suited the new challenges that he faced relative to his father. There were differences, right? I mean, just the fact that he had to build the temple, the growth of the kingdom, these sorts of things, created challenges for Solomon. And so I think he would have had these things in mind as he made those decisions we see there at the start of 1 Kings 4. So I'll put it up on the screen. I don't know if you can read that, but it's people at the front probably can. But I'll verbalise it either way. So first, I'm going to go through sort of two versions of this. The first one is the things that were the same. So for the most part, most things actually were kept the same. We're going to go through the differences in a second. There's about 3 or 4 fairly significant changes, but pretty much everything else structurally is the same. And yeah, so looking at the sort of things that were consistent and reflected the things his father had done, we'll go through a couple of things. So I won't go through everything that's the same, but the first thing I'd say is that the names I've got there in orange, there's certain individuals who I've got there in orange who were loyalists or the children of loyalists through the Adonijah rebellion, okay? So Zadok himself, there was multiple priests. You see some of the positions have multiple people named, and I think that's not because they necessarily were doing it at the same time, but they sequentially they took on the role at different times. You know that because Abiathar's named and he was fired, so he wasn't running that role for the whole time. So yeah, Zadok's there. His grandson was his successor. Benaiah, of course, was put in charge of the army. Azariah, the son of Nathan, the prophet, he was in a key role, and Zabud, also the son of Nathan, was in another key role, reporting directly to Solomon. So there's this theme of rewarding loyal people and keeping people close who were loyal, which is a fair consideration. You don't want to have people whose loyalty is questionable in a senior leadership team like that. Okay, the other things, a couple other things, variation on a theme. He appointed some people who were, again, either they worked for his father and obviously did a great job, or they were the children of people who worked for his father. So Elihoreph ben Shisha, so his father was David's scribe. And then over here, this wasn't the son of someone who'd done a great job. This is Adoniram. So over the tribute was Adoniram, and he was literally the person over the tribute for his father. And he must have started pretty young, because he was actually in that role when Rehoboam took over. And very sadly, of course, Rehoboam sent him to his death, as he sent him to collect just a bit too much tax, essentially. He died because of the foolishness of Solomon's own son. So Adoniram was sort of at this point, none of that, of course, was considered at this point, but at this point he was just rewarded because he was really good at the role. Obviously he wanted to do it, and so he kept him involved. So lots of things were the same because they were working. I forgot the last point there. There was also family connections. So we might say this is nepotism, but I don't think it's right to just say every time you see family connections in an organisation or in ecclesial life that it's nepotism. I think that's presumptuous. Solomon had family members involved in his organisation, right? Benadab married Taphath, so that's his son-in-law, and then because Taphath was one of his daughters, Basemath was another. Her husband was also. They weren't appointed in the leadership team. They were in the layer under. There was the head of the officers, had 12 geographic leaders that the kingdom was split into under them, and 2 of those 12 geographic leaders were son-in-laws to Solomon. And then there was Baana, the son of Hushai, and Hushai the Archite was, of course, a great loyalist to David, Solomon's father. So you sort of see these family connections, these loyalists, all that sort of thing rolled into the organisation. So he could rely, presumably he thought he could rely on these people. But there were some differences. So like I said, there's about 3 or 4 things that were fairly significant changes that Solomon made. And again, we're going to do a bit of a question thing because I want you to, one or two are easy and 1 or 2 are hard. I want you to sort of try and tell me, why do you think, and I don't actually, we're just speculating, but it's just a bit of fun, like why do you think he would have done these things? So first, pretty simple change he made was he merged the army and the special guard, the leadership of that. So under David, he had the head of the army, Joab mostly, and then he had the head of the Cherethites and the Pelethites, which is sort of the SAS as I described them last time, the elite king's bodyguard. Had those 2 groups, and they both reported directly to David. Solomon did away with that, and he just merged them into one, which is more conventional. That's more like a military we'd see, in Australia or somewhere else. You have one leader of the military, not sort of 2. Why do you think Solomon would have merged them? To stop insurrection?
Because David was sending men out to fight and leading some men home, so it was sort of like protection and offence.
You could both be right. I don't actually know, but I think I can speculate better than that.
Maybe as a teenager, whatever, he was aware of the competition between the 2 authorities.
Yeah, I think that's getting warmer. So a way of making the question easier is, it's trickier if you say, why did Solomon merge them? Why did David split them? Luke?
Yeah, well, I was going to say, is it because David couldn't do that? Because Joab, he wouldn't have wanted Joab.
There you go, yeah. That's inspired speculation. So I think David split it because he couldn't trust Joab. And you see how that played out in the rebellion of Adonijah. The only reason he stopped that is through the Cherethites and the Pelethites. He had Benaiah in his back pocket because he didn't report to Joab, as he should have. That would be the more normal structure. He split him out, and Joab would have hated that. He would have hated it. Like I say, he was a control freak. But it's such a clever thing to do because he did not trust that man. But he couldn't quite get rid of him. That's a long story, but he couldn't quite. So that's kind of why I think that was probably the case. But I'm speculating. You might be right. Okay. Another thing he did is this role here is a big role. So this individual ran these divisions to his 12 divisions. Right. They were called them the administrative districts. So this was quite different to David. David had tribal splits, so same sort of thing, but they were tribally based geographic splits, the 12 tribes of Israel. And he also had these functional leaders, as we'll see. But just focusing on this for a second, it was sort of the same but different. He went away from the tribes and he just went to non-tribal geographic splits of the 12 areas, and then he put these governors in charge. Why do you think and again, it's speculation. Why do you think he might have done that? Why would you go away from the tribal structure, which was geographic, to a non-tribal geographic structure? Yeah?
They could be more even in size.
More even in size? That wasn't what I was going to say, but that actually might make sense. Yeah, possibly just to even up the square meterage and the head count and that sort of thing. That would make sense. Yeah. I think that reason might be better than my reason. The reason might be. The reason I thought of is just because Solomon was going to have a really difficult time. He had a lot of challenges ahead of him, and just the inherent interpersonal risk around having tight family structures. The kingdom split around tight family structures and the potential for conflict between those. And I thought, maybe he just thought, let's just break that up, break up the families, and let's have a non-tribal structure, because that perhaps had a tendency towards conflict. But yeah, I don't know. Yeah, that's actually probably just a better reason. Yeah, perhaps he was just evening things up. So just interesting to think about. We don't know exactly why. Another thing he did with that was it was quite a simple structure. He just had these 12 divisions, and he did away with something that David had. So David, across those geographical tribe splits, he sort of had this matrix structure where he had the head of the vineyards, and what else we got there? The head of the lands, and all these different heads of things that sort of sat over all the areas and provided this, functional discipline, or whatever you want to call it, across those. So it is what you would call today a matrix structure. So Solomon said, no, not having a matrix structure, get rid of the functional heads, just geographic heads, that's all I want. So why do you think he might have done that? This is even more speculative, so there's no wrong answer.
More unified nation.
More unified? Yeah, potentially. Yeah. Hated what? Middle management? Aren't you a middle manager? Yeah. I think so, but David had that. They were just tribal, but Solomon just completely got rid of these functional leaders. The person in charge of the vineyards across all areas, the person in charge of the land across all areas, and so on. There was heaps of them. So yeah, again, I don't know. So my theory is perhaps it was just that sort of matrix structure can be quite powerful, but it's just so complex, just a complicated structure. And Solomon had enough headaches without dealing with this, matrixy structure. So whatever the case, he absolutely simplified the whole business by removing those positions. And then lastly, and this can be for the children, new position. So this position wasn't even in David's structure. All the other ones were. The head of the household, or the palace manager, is what some translations call it. Why do you think he had to create this whole new role that David didn't even have it, that reported to him, called the palace manager, or the head of the household? Children. I won't repeat that. What's that? And got lots of kids? Yeah, it's related to that. Yeah. Any adults? Too many wives. Yeah, people keep saying the wives, and it is related to that. I mean, he didn't have this whopping big palace. David didn't have it. The palace in the big sense, the super palace, was Solomon's thing. He brought that in, and I think that would have necessitated, a new senior role, because it was so big. The operation of that palace was crazy. It was so complex. Just the food and that sort of thing that's described in the divine record. Number of staff, all that sort of thing. So it was a huge role. David didn't have a palace, anything like that, so it probably wasn't as much of a headache as to warrant a senior position like that. Okay. So as I said, there was plenty of stuff that was kept the same, but there was definitely things that he changed. There's a few fairly fundamental tweaks that Solomon made there relative to what his father had. And I think it's really interesting to sort of look at the contrast of how he's had to weigh those things up. I say that because sometimes in ecclesial life we are faced with decisions sort of like Solomon here, right? We have to think about how we're going to do things. And the context can be a little bit like what Solomon was dealing with here, right, at the start of his reign. Do we drive change, or do we keep things exactly the same, or fairly the same? Because they're working fine. And we will all have our personal biases towards, some people have a real bias towards change, some people have a real bias towards not changing anything. And I think it tends to be based on things like our personality and our age and just different backgrounds, things like that. So we will all be different in terms of our change appetite. Some people have very low and some people have really quite high. And of course, most folks are somewhere in between. But what I think we should take away from Solomon's approach here is that we have to see the merits of both. He saw the merits of both, and we have to look to overcome our personal biases and look to be relatively balanced in how we consider these things. Positive, well-considered change, change where ideally people are sort of brought along on the journey, ideally, if it's significant, is something we should reasonably embrace. But not just for the sake of it. Change takes effort. Solomon didn't change everything. In fact, he changed less than he didn't change. And change is not without its risks. It can cause issues, because by definition it's relatively unproven. It's changed. We can't always just point off to somewhere else or some other meeting and say, "Oh, they do this," and bring it here. It's not always valid. There's different contexts, there's different circumstances, there's different people, human beings, right? So there is an element of the unproven to change generally. So we've got to do it with a little bit of care. And Solomon, I think he did a great job of balancing these principles and thinking it through and coming up with a structure and a team that really worked for him. And it must have been a fantastic structure and a fantastic team when you look at what he went on to achieve. He got it right by balancing those principles. But Solomon didn't just use the talents of his fellow Israelites, like you see there in his team, to just sort of get things done. He also relied on an old family friend, and his name was Hiram. We've already mentioned him. Now he comes into Solomon's life, or the record proper, in 1 Kings chapter 5. Okay, so let's just go there. We'll just read a little bit about him. 1 Kings 5 verse 1, Hiram king of Tyre sent his servants unto Solomon, for he had heard that they had anointed him king in the room of his father. For Hiram was ever a lover of David. ESV says Hiram always loved David. Now Solomon wanted to involve Hiram in the temple project. So what he does is it was actually Hiram who made the initial approach, but Solomon sees a great opportunity here and he sends him a letter. And we read about that in verse 5. And behold, I purpose, he says, to build a house under the name of Yahweh my God, as Yahweh spoke unto David my father, saying, Thy son, whom I will set upon thy throne in thy room, so instead of you, he shall build a house unto my name. Now therefore command thou that they hew me cedar trees out of Lebanon, and my servants shall be with thy servants, and unto thee will I give hire for thy servants according to all that thou shalt appoint. For thou knowest that there is not among us anyone that can skill to hew timber like unto the Sidonians. So Solomon is essentially, he requests for Hiram to supply him Lebanese timber, the best timber available to build the temple. He also asks him, not everything's recorded in this in 1 Kings, but in Chronicles, 2 Chronicles 2:7, it tells us that he asked for a master craftsman, an elite craftsman, to be sort of seconded across to him to help with those finer details, who was also called Hiram. And in return, he offers a few things. He says, I'll help you with the labour, which he did. He offered payment, and he also offered payment in the form of food, actually. That comes up in 2 Chronicles 2 verse 10. So it was there was some complexity to the deal. There was a few things given in exchange for some other things. So you see on the screen there representation of Hiram working as he did. He accepted the proposal, and he got to work getting that wood prepared for the temple. So this is essentially a contractual proposal between the two to form a three-way a construction alliance to get the temple built. And I'll show you. I'll put this on the screen as well. So this is pretty much how this looked. So there's Adoniram. So you saw he was part of the broader Solomon's leadership team. Now he was in charge of the tribute. He had 80,000 Gentile stone cutters under him, and then 70,000 Gentile stone transporters who had to drag the rocks. So pretty tough work. To the temple site, because of course they couldn't strike the rocks at the temple site, because that was honouring the principle of not wanting man's sort of fingerprint, as it were, on that construction site. Then there was a bunch of Jewish lumberjacks involved. There was 30,000 of them. There was specialist Zidonian lumberjacks. They were the experts, which Solomon acknowledged. He was, like I said at the start, he was good at identifying other people's strengths and getting them involved. He got those folks involved. They were working for Hiram. And then there was Hiram Abi, who was the master craftsman, and he did all the intricate work. And those three kind of ran, Adoniram, Hiram Abi, and Hiram the king of Tyre. They pretty much run this as I called it, three-way construction alliance. To manage all those workers, there's obviously a lot of workers there. There was 3,850 supervisors, 250 Jews, 3,600 Gentiles, which gives you I just worked this out because I thought it was I was curious to see what the supervision ratio was, if anyone works in construction. So it's 40 to 1. 40 workers to one supervisor, which is really high. You would not do that, anything like that today. And you sort of think about that, like why would they do that? And I have a theory, but maybe you can talk about it at dinner, because I'm not sure, but it's just an interesting thing to think about. Why would they have such high supervision ratios when today people would just go rogue if you did that? You need to have a few more supervisors to the workers. Anyhow, all that's kind of interesting to consider. It's also interesting to consider the tax or the tribute, right? So under Adoniram, he's got all these workers, and it took me a little while to figure this out when I was looking at it, but the tax wasn't actually cash, like we think of tax. It was labour. It was manual labour. You had to go and drag stones or chip stones out for a period of time working for him. I'll just read from the ESV, 1 Kings 5:13. King Solomon drafted forced labour out of all Israel, and the draft numbered 30,000 men. And so this is effectively the tax. And he sent them to Lebanon, 10,000 a month in shifts. They would be a month in Lebanon, 2 months at home. Adoniram was in charge of the draft. So in a way, he was kind of a slave leader, a slave driver. So it was this. It was like we talk about FIFO rosters and that sort of thing. It was a 1 month on, 2 month off roster using slaves. And that's a pretty generous roster. The most generous roster you get these days is even time, 2 and 2 or something, 1 and 1 or something like that. There's a really generous roster, but I do wonder if it's not because the work was absolutely brutal. They probably had blisters and sores and broken things after a month, and they needed 2 months to heal. Whatever the case, that also is speculation. But Adoniram was the tax collector. He was the boss of that slave labour. Anyhow, when we step back and look at all these different arrangements, all these things that Solomon pulled together, irrespective of the exact details. The exact details don't necessarily matter that much, or the supervision ratios or anything like that. It's sort of interesting, but I don't know that it's the key to the whole story. What I find most I suppose practically important about these things, these records, the way this team operated or the way it's structured, is it's reflective of how Solomon used the talents of other people to get the best results. He was very, very good at that. Even a wise man like him needed lots of advice, and he needed help. And we're not always super good at that, are we? It's like he's saying, he's humble enough to pretty much acknowledge, look, I can't go it alone. Hiram, Adoniram, Zadok, Benaiah, I just do not have the ability to do this. I need you. I need you to help me with this. It's very difficult. I need your help. I don't have master craftsmen like you, Hiram. I don't have the lumber talent that you have. We just don't have it in our whole country. Please help us out. Solomon, remember, he was brilliant. He was staggering. But he was still wise enough as a leader to know that the best results come from working with teams and from getting the best out of different people, letting its members play to their respective strengths. It is a fantastic lesson for ecclesial life. We need to learn to ask people for their advice and actually listen to it. We need to ask for help. And I think this is the principle as to why God has put us in ecclesias in the first place. Paul talks about this in 1 Corinthians 12:29. You don't need to turn it up. Are all apostles, are all prophets, all teachers, workers of miracles? Have all got the gifts of healing? Do all speak with tongues? Do all interpret? They're rhetorical questions, aren't they? They don't even warrant an answer. No. None of us is brilliant at everything, not even close. And so that, I think, in a way, is a lesson. But when you look at the success that followed, that is one of the great lessons of how Solomon built up his team. He was so good at getting people to work to their talents and work together, and it is a good lesson for ecclesial life. Anyway, it worked so well. Solomon's kingdom grew, it became huge, and it became powerful. Last quote, 1 Kings 4 verse 20 says this, 1 Kings 4:20, that Judah and Israel were many, as the sand which is by the sea in multitude, eating and drinking and making merry. And Solomon reigned over all kingdoms, from the river unto the land of the Philistines and unto the border of Egypt. They brought presents and served Solomon all the days of his life. And it's not hard to hear the echoes of the promise to Abraham there is at the reference to the sand in verse 20, which in a sense, just in a sense, was being fulfilled here. This was absolutely phenomenal what was happening in God's kingdom at that time. And it was a glorious reign, culminating in the completion and the dedication of the temple, which did happen. He did pull it off, all thanks to his careful preparations, or his father's careful preparations, the divine wisdom, those wonderful motives we saw, and I do think surrounding himself with lots of really good people and putting him in positions where they could succeed and do what they were good at. And that whole temple project completion, the dedication, all the wonderful things around that is something we will consider in our next study, God willing.